Welcome to the show,
Yeah.
Jeremy. I'm super pumped to have you here, man. Thank you for making the trip. I love the fact that you travel with your wife and your daughter, at least to this show anyways. Because
we try to travel to a lot of them, and I have 3, so it's gotten harder over the years, but we definitely travel with the youngest.
It's inspiring to me, though, because, I got my first on the way, and that's probably one of my main concerns is like, how am I going to continue to do the things that I've been called to do and the things that I've been doing for the last 5 years of my life when all of a sudden now we have a child in the picture?
Well, the first year, it's a lot easier, man, because on an airplane, they're free until they're 2. So if they could sit on your lap, they don't charge you anything the first year.
It's inspiring to me, dude. Like I think you're setting a really cool example.
Thank you.
By choosing to live your life that way and keep your family together and continue to do life and follow your passions with your family alongside you, man.
And it's not always ideal, like you try to do your best. A lot of times I have to go by myself, but we bring the kids when we can. And the thought process behind it is, number one, you want to be with your family, but number two, like I do this so that I can spend time with my family. Like I don't want them to think like, because daddy does these things, we don't see him. Yep. So we've tried to, as much as we can, make it a point. It's not always possible. My oldest, she's 7, almost 8, and she's been to, I think, 17 countries. So it's like they've definitely gotten to see the world because of what we do, not because, they don't miss dad because of that.
That's amazing, man. We're going to talk about the Roman Empire today.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into that here in a minute. That's the main meat of the show. I've got a lot of questions for you, and specifically we're going to talk about, or I'm going to ask you questions. We're going to discuss the influence that the Roman Empire had on the culture and the people during the time of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And because it's scattered all throughout the scriptures. By the way, are you a Christian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was baptized Catholic.
Okay, outstanding. It's so then it's like intermingled all throughout the scriptures. And a guy like me, I'm like reading about Herod and Pontius Pilate and these and all these things and even around the crucifixion. I'm like, how does all this fit together? So
sure.
That's going to be the meat of the show. But I want to say another personal note on you. Your bio here is you're like, this is like the perfect bio for somebody that I would want to sit down and talk to.
Oh, thank you.
Studied Catholic theology and world religions with a focus on Judaism.
My thesis was actually, an undergrad was in Judaism, like what they're looking for in a Messiah, because every sect of Judaism is looking for something different. So it was just kind of interesting to see, because I'm very interested in how people think and what motivates them. So it's just interesting to see that.
We could do a whole podcast just on that. I mean, seriously,
well, because like Reform Judaism, they're not looking for a person; they're looking for a time period. So it's like all different things that are being looked for.
Yeah. Graduate work specialized in early Roman Empire propaganda, exploring how storytelling and symbolism shaped belief and power. Studied literature at Oxford University, immersing himself in classical Catholic texts. So are you still part of the Roman Catholic Church, or
I would say I'm more non-denominational than anything
okay.
now. Like, my belief system's changed as I've gotten older.
Okay. I know you've made some very intriguing comments to me about one of my favorite figures, Martin Luther. We might get into those kind of toward the end of the show.
Yeah, so I have 2 different YouTube channels. I have the Roman Pattern, where we really just talk about things Rome. My other channel is called Hidden Forces in History. And on that one, we actually recently did an episode about medieval banking. And that actually has a huge effect on, we can get into this later, but it has a huge effect on what caused Martin Luther. So it's kind of interesting.
See, I have no clue about any of that. It's also intriguing to me, man. And then CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand, a media relations company, Command Your Brand. And this is the thing that I wanted to say, because I think the audience ought to hear it. So I follow your personal page, but I also follow your company page, Command Your Brand, and I look at the content that you are putting out through Command Your Brand, and it's so real, man. And one of the things that I told you out there a minute ago that I really appreciate you, we talked about how you travel with your family and this and that, but I appreciate your hustle, dude.
Thank you.
And that's the message that you're putting out through Command Your Brand to your potential clients. Is not that like you're not putting out this false message that like, hey, if you just come and work with us, like everything's gonna blow up and it's gonna be easy and it's like,
well, because people have a false idea on that, right? I think when you're looking at media, everybody wants an elevator. You know, it's kind of like they want to go to Golden Corral and buy some of this, buy some of that, buy some of that. And it's about building real, authentic brand. And that can take years, man. Like it really can to really create something that communicates. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to get hundreds of leads overnight or whatever it might be. But if you change your perception, if you change how people look at you because you're seen as more credible or more authoritative, that there's endless worth to that, right? And you can have some incredible conversations because of that.
But it takes time and it takes work and it takes you dialing in what it is you have to offer to people. It takes you giving away what you have to offer to the world for free for a long, long time before you get a return on that investment. And I just really think people have lost sight of that. And that's why the messaging that you're putting out through your company here it's so inspiring to me, man, because your hustle is how it's so relatable to me because it's how I got to the place that I am here right now. And I think people have just lost sight of that, and they just are expecting that, like, you know, okay, well, somebody should immediately start like paying me to do this or paying me to come here or this and that. And it's like, I don't know, man. I guess as I was coming up, going to seizing opportunities, I always saw them as opportunities. And the expectation was never, especially for the first 3 or 4 years, was never that it was going to cost me money.
Exactly.
It was going to cost me money.
Yeah.
But I was passionate about what I had to share. I thought I had something good to offer, and I saw it was making impact on people's lives, and I trusted that if I made those investments, that eventually the Lord would make a way for me to do this for a living.
Well, I think some people want to put the cart before the horse, right? They you have to understand that people have to know you, like, and trust you. They have to see you as credible, and they have to see that you're there to help, right? And I think the whole, like, influencer economy has really damaged that in a lot of ways, and the world we live in now, that seems to be, I guess, dying out in a lot of ways, because I come from more of a, you know, internet marketing type background, and in that world, you have this whole idea of coaching coaches to be coaches, and it's this kind of predatory monetization model rather than, you know, what real value can I give to people. And I look at over the years, you know, I've had changes in my content and things I talk about, and I'm actually right back to what I went to school for. And for me, it's really on purpose, and I'm really enjoying that. But, you know, there's been times, I remember 2 years ago, my child that you just met, Percy, she was just born, and she was born in June. In July, I had one trip where I got invited to come to the RNC, so I was there, and then I went from there to another show in Vegas, and from there to another show in Austin, and that was like in a 3-day period. And it's like, when you get invited for opportunities, you take them, man, because every opportunity is an ability to, you know, meet someone else, have the next best conversation. At the same time, something people don't consider is the ability to take your current thesis or your current, what you talk about, and improve it, right? Because I kind of look at now what I call what I do in Roman history, the Roman pattern. I look at civilizational collapse and kind of the 3 key components that go into that. It's taken me a lot of years to really hone in, what is that? What's it called? How does it work? And a lot of times that happens by conversations. So these conversations are opportunities to improve that and to sharpen it.
It's a rep. It takes repetition to dial that in.
It's the idea of iron sharpens iron, right? There's a book by Dave Draper. I don't know if the blonde bomber, he was a Mr. Olympia in the 60s. And his book is called brother iron, sister steel. And it's just the idea when you're looking at, even building a body, it is the idea of, more reps, more ability to do things, more ability to shape things. And it's the same concept.
And it's amazing you mentioned that. These principles that we're talking about here are the same in all aspects of life, because you have a background as a bodybuilder too. And so it's like these principles are the same. What we're talking about here, there's no other way. So before we get into the kind of nerdy stuff, I just wanted to put that out there for the listeners as an encouragement to you guys who are listening, who maybe you're just getting started in a business or just starting your brand. Just understand there's no other way than the way, like I agree, there are anomalies every now and then.
You can get an opportunity that can skyrocket you, but that's likely not going to happen for most people. Exactly,
man. And this is an awesome resource also, Command Your Brand. This is an awesome resource for people. Like, I appreciate the resource that you're offering through this company, because I was blessed to have a friend who basically had all the connections that helped me even get my start. But not everyone, like very few people have that friend kind of built into their life. You know what I mean?
My wife went to school for PR, so that's been my kind of, big thing I've had in my back pocket. That's helped me my whole career,
That's amazing, man. You're doing awesome work, dude.
Thank you.
I just want to encourage you, man. You're doing awesome work. You're hustling. It's an inspiration to me. And just the opportunity to have you here, I'm super thankful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
That's awesome, brother. All right. So we'll get into some of the nerdy stuff here. Again, I'm trying. We're going to be talking about things. You said your expertise was third century.
Third century, so like the 200s to the 300s. So I know a lot about the time period we're going to talk about, but at the same time, I also wanted to respect your platform, and I spent a lot of time also reading even more the last couple of days just to make sure I can really give you the best information. Because the thing I just want to point out is I'm not infallible. I don't consider myself a historian. I'm somebody that recognizes patterns, and that's what I'm looking for in history. So definitely excited for the conversation today, but at the same time, I spent quite a bit of extra time because I want to make sure that I give your audience the kind of the best primer to this that we can. And if I make a mistake, I apologize, but my goal is to get you to look for yourself. That's really what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. And amen to that, brother. And my goal is to have fun with this, man, to have fun with this. So we're going all the way back to the first century.
Yeah. So in my master's thesis, my actual emphasis was on the Emperor Augustus, who's the first emperor from the first century. So I do have a lot of primer on that. And then in my undergrad, since I spent a lot of time on Catholic theology, I have a lot of primer on kind of that early time period as well. So I think we're going to have some fun today.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I guess from a broad perspective for us Christians who are reading the scriptures, and the first kind of question in a broad sense that comes up in your mind is, well, what was the Roman Empire even doing in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas? How did things wind up this way? How long had it been like this up to the time, as we're reading through the Gospels, the time of Christ? Like, what's going on here? Why are they even there?
So I guess to understand that, we have to kind of have our primer to like, what is Rome? And I think when people hear that, everybody thinks of the Roman Empire. But Rome it's essentially 4 eras in time, like 3 eras if you want to look at the kind of the classical decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which is the famous book written by Edward Gibbon in 1776. But it's 3 eras in time. It's founded in 753 BC as a kingdom. There's traditionally 7 kings. Then in 509, the last king is removed by the first consul of Rome. Consul was kind of like being president, but they would have 2 of them at once because they didn't want one man to hold power. He's removed by the first consul, Brutus. The Brutus family, or the Bruti, is the same family that will kill Caesar almost 500 years later. So it goes from 509 BC to 31 BC as a republic. And it's not a republic like we would think of a republic. It's a lot closer to an oligarchy because it's like 10% literacy rate. And it was really only the literate and the wealthy that were actually running everything. So when our founding fathers created our republic, they were looking at the best aspects of monarchy, the best aspects of a republic, and the best aspects of democracy. And they tried to like combine them for what we have here in America. But from then 31 BC to 476 AD is the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, if you want to have that fourth era in time, goes from like 305 to 476 AD. So it's essentially 2,000 years in time. And to understand kind of how Rome managed territories around it, during the Republic, the way they would do that is they would, when they took over a territory, they wouldn't demand taxes, they wouldn't demand things that were, I guess, different from what your society did. They would demand soldiers, because if you had soldiers, you could continue to conquer. And conquest is one of the big things that continues to grow Rome as an entity. And when you look at how Jerusalem fits in this whole thing, there is the Maccabean revolt, which happens, I think, around 160-ish AD, or BC, I'm sorry. And that's basically where they're breaking away from the Romans and from kind of control in that area. So now they've got some sort of autonomy. Then you're going to have in the 60s BC, there's the kind of dynasty that goes after the Maccabean revolt that starts fighting amongst itself. So Pompey the Great, who's a Roman general, is going to go in under the guise of, well, I'm going to be a peacemaker and I'm going to end this civil war that's currently happening in Jerusalem. And the Romans never leave. It is really what ends up happening. And so it's ruled as a province. The province during that time, it gets this name later on, but in the 120s AD, it's going to be called Syria Palestina, is what it's going to be when it's fully a Roman territory. But it has a governor, which is, when we hear of Pontius Pilate, he would be considered someone who's the governor of the territory. But you have this Pompey the Great coming in 60 BC, and it starts to be run more like a territory of Rome. Now, what that's going to mean is you can practice your religion, you can have kind of your own government structures, but there's still like a Roman governor that's in charge. It's kind of like the buck stops here type of thing. Then if you go a little bit further in the timeline, we cross over from BC to AD, and in the mid-60s AD, there's a tax revolt. And this Roman general named Vespasian comes in and starts to crush this tax revolt. During that time period, he's actually going to become emperor. So his son Titus is going to be the one that actually finishes off the conquest of Jerusalem. And that's kind of when the diaspora happens, and a lot of Jews leave during that time period. And it's going to start to become a more well-established part of the Roman Empire at that point in time. And actually, a lot of the wealth that was in the temple at that point in time is actually what's used to build the Colosseum, which in that time period would have been called the Flavian Amphitheater. So initially, Rome comes in as a quote-unquote peacemaker to end the civil war, but they just never really leave. And if you look at kind of patterns in history, emergencies are oftentimes when we lose autonomy, we lose our ability to do things the way we want to because we take whatever we can get at that time, right? Yeah. And I think it's quite similar to how Jerusalem ended up under the heel of Rome. Is initially Pompey's trying to create peace in this civil war that's occurring. Government becomes established, and it becomes a much more well-established thing.
Yeah, man. So essentially, the Roman Empire starts in Rome and just expands out from there. Like, correct. They're just expanding and conquering as much as they possibly have the resources and the manpower to do so. I'm putting all this in layman's terms, all right?
Well, and it's going to reach its furthest extent in 117 AD, and at that point in time, they're just trying to preserve what they have. Gotcha. Because it's gotten so large, it's very hard to control.
Yep. But as they grow, as they expand out and they absorb these, territories, or like Jerusalem, for instance, they're not coming in as tyrants. I think that's
and no. I think that's an important point to mention, because there was a requirement when Rome took over your territory that you would be expected to offer sacrifices to Roman gods. But that doesn't mean they're not going to permit other religions as long as you're offering those sacrifices. But now, if you look at monotheism, like in terms of, Judaism and Christianity, that's not acceptable, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not something that's going to be allowed. So that is one of the major things that's going to cause tension between Rome and Judaism early on, but Christianity even later. And so if you look at Romans had this idea of when things weren't going well, it was because they needed to restore something called the peace of the gods. And if you look at, there's many different Christian persecutions in the Roman Empire, but there's the major ones. There's one under Nero after the fire of Rome in 64 AD. There's another major one in 250 under Emperor Decius, and he's experiencing several different things. The beginning of barbarian invasions, climate change, and he thinks he can solve those things by persecuting Christians. You're also going to have another major one under Diocletian in the late 3rd century. So the thing you will see is they permit those things until they feel like things are a bit too out of control and they have to restore this peace of the gods, and they get really heavy-handed during that time period.
That is wild.
Yeah.
Man. Had no idea about any of that. Yeah, because we see, like when we read through the scriptures, we see that the Roman government is existing right alongside the Jewish courts, and it seems like they're just allowed to exist simultaneously together. But
because they cared about politics, they didn't care as much about local government. But if it became a political problem for them, well, then they would start to care. So like if you look at even the crucifixion of Christ, early on they didn't care until it became a political problem within a Jewish territory. So now that's when Rome steps in and feels like they have to do something.
Gotcha. I have a question here.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a very broad question, but just wanted to get any context from you about, at least during the time of Christ or the time right there around his crucifixion, what was the Jewish posture toward the Roman rule of Jerusalem? Was there a lot of tension? Because we have one of the main disciples who wrote Matthew. Mm-hmm. He was a tax collector for the Roman government, yeah. I guess. So, I mean, the Jews didn't all hate Rome being there. They were integrated into even collecting taxes for them.
So I think that's an interesting question, because that's a really good point. So tax collectors, by the way, were called publicani, and it was an actual career you could have. And basically, Rome would say, publicani guy, you owe us this much in taxes. Anything you kept above that, you got to keep. That's how they made their profit. So it's a kind of a really interesting career, and tax collectors were often hated because they would charge double, triple, quadruple what they were supposed to charge because they wanted to line their own pockets. And so that's, I guess, one point to understand about that. But if you're looking at, we talked about early on when I said in my undergrad work, I was looking at what are different sects of Judaism looking for in a Messiah. And if you look at how Judaism looked at the Roman Empire in that time period, it was different, because there were certain of the, higher political classes would have liked it because it would have offered them money, wealth, privilege, but then others didn't like it so much, right? So you do have revolts that happen. Okay. Like if you remember in the Gospels, there's this idea of, should we release Barabbas or should we release Jesus?
That's confusing.
Barabbas had been somebody that had uprisen against the Roman government, and that's why he was a prisoner, because now that's a problem, right? We're going to permit it, but now it becomes a political problem. So once it's a political problem, he becomes a prisoner. So these things did happen when they were unhappy, or when certain groups within there were unhappy. It didn't mean everyone was unhappy. So it's different than when you look at the Babylonian captivity, of where nobody wanted to be there, right? In this case, there were certain groups that profited and did well, and they were fine with it, and there were others that wanted freedom and wanted everything out. So it's hard to kind of give a blanket answer.
Yeah.
It would depend on, for you as an individual, how did it benefit you? Like Herod was installed by the Romans. So he's going to like that. He's going to like Rome because it gives him political position as kind of a client king in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So it would depend on how beneficial was it for you to have Rome there.
That's complex, man. That would have been a complex
Well, it's like
society.
politics today, though, right? Like, you even look at like a Republican Party, Democratic Party. Within those parties, there's various different groups that want different things as well. So it's not that much different if you look throughout history,
Yeah. I want to kind of dig into one of the most key points in our faith, and revolving around the narrative of the crucifixion of Christ, and understanding the Roman interplay surrounding that event, because there seems to be a lot of back and forth between the Jewish high priests and the Roman government. And I just want to understand more about why that back and forth was happening. Obviously somebody didn't have authority to do this and somebody did. And I have some specific questions around that, because when we read the narrative in the Gospels, it can be very confusing to us, just trying to figure out what's going on here. But I guess the first thing, since we're going to talk about the crucifixion of Christ, crucifixion, I have heard, was a Roman method of capital punishment. Yes. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there's something. It was something that was done with different sorts of criminals, but it's also something that's done in mass at certain time periods. So, like after Spartacus rebels, him and all his men are crucified, and the reason is because the Romans want you to see, you do this, that's happening to you. Like, it was supposed to be kind of a visual penalty, that it was less about the person it was being done for and more about other people seeing it. It was supposed to be an example. Or Julius Caesar, as a young man, is captured by pirates. And it's kind of a weird story around Caesar and the pirates, because he would kind of work out with them, do different things with them, but he'd kind of joke, one day I'm going to have you guys crucified. And they would laugh, like, that's not going to happen to us. So he comes back to Rome, and the Senate won't approve crucifying these pirates, so he privately raises the money and keeps his promise and crucifies them. So it's a penalty that's meant to show...
These jokers were rough, dude.
They were rough, but it's a penalty that was less about you having the punishment done to you, because for the most part, it is a pretty quick way to die, because they would suffocate eventually because of trying to hold their bodies up. It's more about other people seeing you, because they would leave them up for days, and crows and other animals would start to do their job, which is removing skin and all their sorts of things. So it was a very gruesome punishment, and it was meant to be an example to other people. And it was more about, for Rome, people that were seen as political problems, because for them, they wanted to keep the political system very in line. Because if there's a political problem, it became a problem for, in the Republic, the consuls keeping things in order, but in the empire, the emperor keeping his power. So they wanted to preserve anything that would seem like it was a political problem.
It seems like it would be a highly effective
it's a deterrent
to provide an example, because from what little I have studied about crucifixion, it's not necessarily as pretty as it is even depicted on the most popular graphic, gory movies like The Passion of the Christ. Like, these men were being crucified naked.
Yeah,
like it's the ultimate humiliation. Like, you are hanging naked on a cross, and everyone is watching you suffer and die, completely humiliated. Like, how could you even come up with something like that?
There's a series on Starz, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Spartacus, and there's a couple different seasons of it. But
I haven't.
The latest season that came out, it's not the Spartacus Blood and Sand, but whatever the one after that is. It has a really good example of what that would have looked like, and the gladiators were responsible in the show, but not as a whole throughout Rome. But in the show, are responsible for actually removing the crucified people from these crosses, and you kind of get the idea of just how gruesome it was. It's not anywhere near as nice as what we've seen in popular culture or at church or anything else. It was quite gruesome. But it was meant to deter other people. It was less about punishing the person it was being done to.
And I really wanted to point this out, because the fact that this is a uniquely Roman method of capital punishment, it's quite an interesting point because of the prophecies about the crucifixion of Christ in the Old Testament scriptures, which would have been written, I assume, prior to the idea of or this method of capital punishment.
They're written hundreds of years before that. It's over time, right? You have things that are written in Babylonian captivity, you have things that are written well before that. So it's over a long period of time, which a lot of which would have actually been written before Rome existed.
That's what I was wondering, if that was the case, because...
Well, there's certain books that are written very early, certain that are written later, and then more of the New Testament, especially, the epistles of Paul and things like that, you're going to get more of an idea of what was actually happening during the Roman time period.
Yep. So that, to me, that is that's a pretty encouraging thing to think that we have these Old Testament prophecies about Christ that are indicating this method that will be used to essentially murder the Messiah as crucifixion, hanging him on a tree, right? And it's like, well, nobody was crucifying anybody back then. Like, that's
I'm
pretty
sure
miraculous.
there were various punishments that were similar to that were done by other people. I'm not sure if the Romans fully thought it up, but it does become, I guess, perfected in a way under the Romans.
So moving through, I guess, just to move through the gospel narrative and to kind of unpack that and how this interplay was happening. Obviously, Jesus is betrayed by Judas, and a cohort goes out from the chief priests, which would have been the Jewish authority, and they go out to the garden, capture Jesus, bring him back, and they hold their own little trial first.
Which they would have been allowed to do. And once again, it doesn't become a problem for the Romans until it's perceived as a political problem. But continue.
Yeah, so no, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, because they were allowed to hold their own trials for their own religious conflicts and stuff like that.
Well, because especially in a province like that, rule would have been less stringent than it would have been in a well-established Roman territory. So this is just a province, which means there's a governor, there's going to be a few legions there, nothing intensely crazy. It's not like the Romans were controlling their daily lives.
Gotcha.
When Rome took over your territory, for the most part, you were allowed to govern it as you saw fit, but they would make sure they had some muscle there in case things didn't quite go in the right direction.
Gotcha.
Because they were also looking at their balance sheets. How do we kind of keep costs down for managing some of these territories as well? And Jerusalem is a really important territory because in the Roman Empire, as it expands, the grain for the empire is going to come more and more and more from the east. So it is an important territory that things would have to pass through in order to get to Rome and feed the empire as a whole. So it is something that they would not want chaos in, because that could disrupt the flow lines of food. And that's one of the major things they're looking at.
They hold their own court. Now, why do they have to then bring Jesus to the Roman court? He goes to Pilate first, and then Pilate turns him over to Herod. What's going on with that? Why do they have to take those steps?
Well, because Pilate doesn't see it as much of a problem for him. He doesn't really see it as a political problem. It's more in that point in time that the Pharisees, and I think the Sadducees is kind of the other main group, Jesus has just upset them because his teachings aren't in line with their teachings. So for them, it's a religious problem. And he doesn't really want to deal with a religious problem. Now, if it was they were disrespecting the god Jupiter or something like that, well, now that's a problem for Pilate. But for him, it's not really a political problem. And that's, you had mentioned the idea of King of the Jews. That's, well, in your notes to me, not here, but that's actually an important point, because that's how they would get Rome concerned about it. Because Rome would then say, well, we don't want another king that we haven't put in place. So that's how it becomes a problem for them. That's one of the major pieces of crucifixion, because it's an example of, well, this is what we do to kings that aren't Roman kings.
Yep.
So it's not really a problem for Pilate, and he doesn't really want much to do with it, because he doesn't see him as a guilty man. He doesn't see him as someone that's really done anything wrong until it's really put in his face as, well, this is a political problem for you. Well, then he has no choice but to do something about it.
But the Jewish high priests in their court, did they not have the authority to stone Jesus for his blasphemy against the Jewish God, which was their initial charge?
They could have done that. I don't know why they don't choose to do that, but they could have done that. That was something that would have been acceptable. But I think...
Because that's what I'm wondering. Like, why?
Romans would have always had power over life and death, but at the same time, like, stonings did happen. Like, those things did occur. So they could have chosen to do that. I honestly don't know why they didn't choose to do it that way, but they could have done that had they wanted to.
I've always wondered that, man, because even not too long after the crucifixion and the resurrection, you have an example of these same people in Jerusalem stoning Stephen for the same reasons.
Well, it would have become a problem for Rome if that stoning turned into a riot, which turned into a civil war. Well, now it's a problem for Rome. But if it doesn't turn into something bigger that escalates, they really don't care that much.
So they take him to Pilate, even though they could have just they had made their judgment on him. Yes, he's guilty of blasphemy. It is odd, and you say, we don't know why on earth. They pronounced
maybe somebody else does, but I don't know.
They pronounced him guilty. You would think the next step would be they take him out and stone him, and that would have been the traditional Jewish method of capital punishment. But instead of doing that, they take him to Pilate, and they want Pilate to basically pronounce him guilty of blasphemy, and they want Jesus killed. But like you said, Pilate says, look, what are you talking about here? It doesn't matter to me if he's, blaspheming against your God. Like,
well, and the thing that's never made sense to me too, because there's, and I apologize if I'm butchering this, but there's a line from the Gospels where they say, "His blood be on our hands and on the hands of our children." So it's like, it's not like they were trying to not be responsible for it, because they're still saying his blood be on our hands and on the hands of our children. So that doesn't 100% make sense to me why it was done that way, but that is how it was done.
I mean, to me, there's no other way to explain it other than the scriptures, the prophecies as they pertain to the life and death of Christ were being fulfilled, because it doesn't make.
Well, I guess
sense.
There's one interesting point to this. So there's one historian living at the time of Christ that actually wrote about him a little bit when he was living, and his name's Titus Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish man that wrote for the Roman emperor and chronicled things. So I guess something to consider is, and I don't know if you would consider this to be something more divine or whatever it might be, if that doesn't happen, we wouldn't have historical proof that Christ lived. We would just have the Gospels. But because it becomes something where now it's a political problem and the Romans are putting someone to death, well, Josephus writes about it. So I think at the same time, that does give us the ability to have physical proof that Christ lived. I know it's a simple thing, but at the same time,
it's huge.
Do you get what I'm saying? Because things happen that give us an example, or they give us proof, or whatever it might be. So that also, historically, just looking from a historical perspective, not a religious perspective, it shows us that he was real and he existed.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying? If that doesn't happen, we may never have that peace.
Yep. And of course, I see that from my perspective as a person of faith, believing that God is sovereign, his plan is being carried out as it is, whether people know they're a part of it or not, they're involved in carrying out his will.
Exactly.
And just having this conversation, I think, is evidence that will and that specific will for Christ, even as it pertains to the manner that he died, and then also going this route, and now by by God's grace, we have, like you said, evidence of the life of Christ. That's even historical evidence,
non-religious evidence. So it's kind of like no one can deny it happened. Do you know what I mean? So as basic as that is, there is a historical point where we can say Christ existed because someone that wouldn't have cared about his belief system or anything else wrote about him.
And if it wouldn't have happened the way it happened,
we wouldn't have that evidence because he wouldn't have a reason to write about it.
If the high priest would have just took him out and stoned him for blasphemy,
that would have never been a historical mention.
That's exactly right, man. Praise the Lord for that.
Yeah. So I know it's not always a positive, but it allows that historical mention to happen because now it's a political uprising.
Yeah, 100%. I would have never drawn that line without this conversation. I mean, so like you mentioned earlier, Pilate doesn't really want to have anything to do with this initially. He does take Jesus and have him beaten or flogged or whatever.
Well, because that's usually where they would have stopped. You know, it was like we're going to discourage the guy, we're going to beat him, and that's kind of the end of it.
And do you think Pilate was doing that? Of course, we're just speculating, but does it seem he would have been doing that just to appease the Jewish people? Like, okay,
that would be my thought process. Is he does that to kind of get them to say, okay, that's good enough. You can stop there, and that's not where it ends, right? But at the same time, I think that was you can see even in the Gospels that Pilate didn't want to do that. He washes his hands of the situation. He wants nothing to do with it. So I think in that it was an attempt to say, okay, we're going to end this here. I've appeased you in some way. And that's, I guess, not where it goes, you know?
Yep. There is a narrative in the Gospels where Pilate's wife also comes to him, and his wife has a dream, and she actually gives him advice, like, have nothing to do with this man. Mm-hmm. Typically, during this period of Roman culture, Did women have an influence in government and culture? Like, how were women treated? Because that's an interesting part in the narrative, that his wife comes and presents him with this advice, and he seems to like really be considering the advice that she gives to him.
Well, women wouldn't directly be holding political office, but they would oftentimes, and I guess the weird part about it is often related to dreams, because even with Caesar, when he's assassinated in 44 BC, his wife has this dream and tells him not to go to the forum because she tells him that he's, something's going to happen to him. And this happens too in the later Severan dynasty in the 3rd century, where Julia Domna has a dream and she's telling Severus, how to not handle his sons, and his sons Caracalla and Gaeta are a little bit crazy. So there is often this dream element to it, which is kind of interesting. But there's kind of two parts to this, right? Because if you look at, I guess, going to Caracalla and his brother and whatnot, the women actually ruled through their sons because their sons were kind of weak in a lot of ways. So you have Julia Domna, Julia Maesa, Julia, I think Emesa is the other one, but no, Emesa is where they were from. But there's 3 Julias basically, and they rule through 4 different emperors that are their children. So you do have that they would have been seen as weak in a lot of ways, but at the same time, these women were very strong women. Mm-hmm. So they were, in a lot of ways, advising their husbands what they thought should be done. So that wouldn't be out of the ordinary, because even Livia, who's the wife of Emperor Augustus, is very often seen as running the empire through him.
Wow.
And you get your second emperor Tiberius because Livia positions it in such a way that Augustus is expected to adopt him and make him the next emperor. So there is a bit of that interplay there where you have these powerful men, but they are willing to, hear what their wives have to say. So that wouldn't be out of the ordinary.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I've always wondered that. Like, is that some like uncommon thing? Were women oppressed by the Roman Empire?
Well, yes and no, because there is also the structure of a Roman household, and it'll change later in the empire. But the word that was often used for a man in his home was dominus, and that translates to Lord. And a man early on had even the power of life and death over his own family. So he could have his children put to death, his wife put to death. So it's kind of a yes and no in that ways. It would depend on like what kind of a man was that man.
Yep.
Because if you give some people the power where they're, a dominus or a lord over their family, they're going to be a bit tyrannical. And you see this throughout history, not just in families. So the Roman man was seen to be very powerful in his own home, oftentimes to the power of life and death.
Wow.
But it would depend on how that man was as a man. Was he somebody that was willing to listen to the opinions of others, or was he someone that just was kind of drunk on his own power?
Yep. Pilate, what we get about Pilate in the biblical narrative, to me, it seems like he was a very thoughtful and wise person. I mean, even his statement to Jesus, what is truth? I mean, I've reflected on that quite a bit. Like, this is a man who has thought deeply about things. Mm-hmm. And because we get that insight into who he is, I have to imagine that the interactions that he had with Christ and the claims that Jesus was making right there in his presence were probably freaking him out a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I mean, he was a deep thinker. I mean, to make that statement, what is truth, in the manner that he made it, like, this guy's thought about this, because that's a valid question.
It's interesting because I feel like Pilate is somebody, in some ways you can feel bad for, and in other ways you can't, right? Because he also authorizes the crucifixion. So it doesn't, I think in the long run, you're still responsible for the things you do. I think that's kind of one part of it. The other part of it is he's also left up with this impossible situation. And you can see that he does not want to do it that way, but in some ways he's left with no choice. So it doesn't absolve him of, kind of what he's done, but in some ways he's left with no choice.
Yeah. And so I guess one of the evidences, we've talked about a few this far, but one of the evidences that he didn't want to crucify Jesus because he didn't see that he was guilty of anything that warranted that type of punishment. He actually sends him to Herod, and Herod is a tetrarch.
He's a client king. He's basically a king that's put in place by Rome, so he's going to do everything Rome wants to do.
And was Herod Jewish?
He was Jewish. He was Jewish. He had lived in Jerusalem or in Rome for some time. He's sent back to Jerusalem to kind of be this client king in a lot of ways, which is something Romans would do. They would prop up client kings. In the empire, that's going to change a bit more because they don't want that other power there now because there is an emperor. But in the Republic, that's permitted a lot more. As you get more into the empire, and Pilate's very early in the empire, right? Because the empire becomes such, there's disagreements on when it becomes an empire, but some say 31 BC, others say 23 BC, because that's when Augustus gets the title of Augustus. So this is kind of very early into this thing, and at that point in time, Romans didn't really understand what Augustus was yet, if that makes sense, and Tiberius would have been the one that most of the things that you hear about in the life of Christ happened during the life of Tiberius, when Tiberius is the second emperor. So for Romans as well, they were also in a power structure change. So they didn't fully understand where they were going. Because one of the things, as I mentioned, my graduate work is really around the propaganda of Augustus. He was a brilliant political operator. Likely not a very good person, but he was a brilliant political operator. And he managed to convince Romans that he wasn't a king. Because, as I mentioned, the last king of Rome is removed. And Romans in the Republic naturally hated the idea of kings. And that was one of the major things that gets Julius Caesar assassinated, is they feel like he's starting to become a king, and that's a real problem. So knowing that, what Augustus does is he creates this new title for himself. In Rome, the guy that's like the Speaker of the House, if we would put it in modern terms of their Senate, is called the Princeps Senatus, or the Prince of the Senate. So what he does is he creates this new position, the Princeps Civitas, or the Prince of the City. And that's the title he gives himself. The word that we use, emperor, actually comes from a military title of imperator. A victorious general leading an army was given the title imperator. So he takes that title to himself, in addition to this Princeps title. And he also pulls in other titles to himself, like tribune, who's the ability to propose and veto laws. He also pulls in the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. He also pulls in the title of censor, which is modernly, we think of the census. The censor was responsible for counting people, but also responsible for kind of the morals of society. So he could remove people from the Senate or add people to the Senate based on how he thought their public morals were. So he manages to create this position that people don't really see him as a king. They probably would have by the time he died because they hadn't had elections in some time. But they're not quite sure what they're doing, right? And when you get kind of your second emperor, Tiberius, we haven't quite realized this is a line of succession yet. So I think the thing to understand politically in this time period, Rome wasn't quite sure what it was yet. In a lot of ways, people thought they were still a republic, but they kind of had this new first citizen before all others. So it is for them a lot of time of change too. So they might have handled this very differently in the 100s or the 200s versus kind of the early first century, if that makes sense.
Dude, no, that's amazing context, man. Like, that's exactly...
Well, they weren't certain of their own identity yet, and I think that also is going to color how this is handled, because if you look in the Republic, they have a lot of client kings, because going further back, Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC, and there's this question of Alexander, who will be your successor? And he says, to the strongest. So his I believe there's 6 or 7 generals at that point in time. They're called the Diadokoi, or the successors of Alexander. And they basically divide up his empire amongst themselves and create these mini kingdoms. A lot of those Hellenistic kings, as they're called, Greeks would have called themselves Hellenes. That's where the word Hellenistic comes from. But a lot of these Hellenistic kingdoms are kind of just client kings of Rome. And as the Republic starts to kind of wind down, they start conquering and deposing some of these client kings. But early in the empire period, you're still going to have some client kings around. So that's why it would have made sense that Herod is politically there as a client king. Client meaning he owed his position to Rome, because they could have just sent in a legion and taken him out, and they didn't do that because having him there was politically expedient.
I like to say, it's amazing context, man. This is exactly why I was so thankful to be able to have this conversation, is because this type of context does help me personally understand better. Well, why did Pilate send him to here? And then why did he send him back to Pilate? And it's like this,
because their processes weren't quite established yet as well, because they had been something different,
Exactly, man.
Not even a full generation before.
Yeah. That's amazing, brother. So eventually, in the gospel narrative of the trial of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ, the chief priests from the Jewish government, they changed the accusation before Pilate to not that this man Jesus has blasphemed against our God, but they shift the accusation to he claims to be a king.
And that's the important point, because now it's a political problem.
Yep.
So now Pilate needs to care, because if it's a political problem, well, now the emperor is going to get pretty upset.
So that was key.
Especially in this key region. As I said, all the grain was going to flow through there.
Yep.
So if you have a civil war in the area that's controlling the flow of grain to your empire, well, that is a huge problem now.
So that was some conniving crap that
Correct.
These chief priests
and they would have
came up
known
with.
that, honestly, right? Or
Yeah.
why would they have done it? They did it because they wanted a certain result, and they know that Rome isn't going to necessarily care about a religious squabble. They're going to care about a political problem.
Yep, that makes total sense, man. So because of this shift in accusation against Jesus, this is the key thing that makes Pilate say, okay, yeah, this is an issue. Pilate signs off on capital punishment, crucifixion of Christ, and the sign that Pilate himself chooses to hang above Christ. This has always been interesting to me. Says that this is Jesus, King of the Jews. It seems like he did that to tick the Jews off, because the Jews didn't like that Pilate hung that sign. Do you have any opinions on...
I don't quite have the context to that. The thing I would say is that goes back to kind of what I had said earlier about, like, let's say if this was Herod, it would have been handled differently because he's a client king. The Romans put him in place. Well, if Jesus is a king and the Romans didn't put him there, that's a big problem for them. So I think it's more of, at least from my perspective, it's supposed to be a discouragement to others that would declare themselves a king. I don't know if it's necessarily to upset the Jews at that one point in time. I think it's more about, if you declare yourself a king and Rome didn't put you there as a king, well, this is what happens to you. I think it's more of going back to crucifixion was an example for other people. It wasn't a great way to die, but for the most part, it was quick because they would break their legs and they would suffocate. And we know that when they go to break Jesus' legs, he's already passed. But I think that's an important point to understand is I don't know, kind of the thing about was it to upset the Jews or not upset the Jews. I think it was more of, well, if you're a king and Rome didn't put you there as a king, or you're not a client of Rome, well, this is what happens to you.
That was the purpose of the sign.
It was more of that, and it's more of a justification of the punishment, right? We did this because, well, this guy's a king. And that would go back to, it's a political problem, so now it's a Roman problem.
Yep. No, that makes total sense, man. Dude, thank you.
Yeah,
that makes total sense, man. So Jesus is crucified. And there's a lot of things go on around that. The soldiers that actually conduct the crucifixion, they're like gambling for his garments or casting lots for his garments, and then they take Jesus off the cross sooner than they normally would, I think, because of the Sabbath day is coming up. So I always thought that was an interesting point that Rome would do that to honor the Jewish Sabbath, and I guess that's just...
Well, they're trying to keep it from becoming a political problem.
They're trying to keep peace,
because, Jews can't work on the Sabbath, and they would have been expected to prepare his body for burial.
Yep.
And they're not going to be doing that in the Sabbath, right? So I think that's a kind of just an important point there, is they're looking at, if we don't honor this thing, we could be creating a political problem. And right now, Pilate's just trying to keep there from being any sort of civil war.
If things would have went sideways and it would have turned into a big civil war, would Pilate's head have rolled?
It could have.
More than likely?
It could have, because they were very hard on not just their military commanders, but also their soldiers. Have you ever heard the term decimation before? Mm-mm. So decem is the Latin word meaning 10. And it meant that, if a military commander had his army not obeying him or they failed him in some way, decimation was they would kill 10% of their own soldiers. And so when we use the word modernly, we're not quite using it in the correct context. Like, oh, we were decimated. It means that they would kill 10% of their own soldiers. And the soldiers that were made to do it were then forced to sit outside of the camp and eat barley, because barley was a grain that gave you a lot of gas. So it was kind of also torture for them in a lot of ways. So they were brutal in how they tortured. So had Pilate failed and had a civil war happen, there likely would have been terrible repercussions for him.
Yeah. So he had a lot invested, his very life invested in some give and take. So around keeping peace in this region. And, we even see an example of kind of along the lines of what you're talking about later on in the book of Acts, when they have, they've imprisoned Peter, and Peter miraculously is escorted out of the prison by an angel, and all of the guards who were meant to be there to keep Peter in the prison were all ordered to be killed. Like, I've always thought
they failed in their position.
Exactly.
That's how Rome ruled, with
that's
a very
extreme.
Heavy hand. Because often their punishments, it's the same as crucifixion, where it's less about the punishment for the person. It was more about others seeing it and seeing, if you mess up in this way or make this mistake, this will happen to you. That's how their punishments were intended.
Yeah.
I think a lot of medieval punishments are quite similar too, like in drawing and quartering or things like that.
Yeah.
Because it's like you're probably already dead by that point, but it's to show other people this will happen to you.
I mean, back then, if you were going to take a position in the Roman government, or even as a soldier, like, it ain't like signing up for the military here, where like if you mess up, you're just going to get to go kicked out and go about your life. You know,
failure wasn't acceptable.
That's wild.
It was not
man.
acceptable in a lot of ways, and Rome ruled in a very heavy hand by that in that way. But at the same time, it worked for them for a really long time. Now, it doesn't mean it was right, but it did work for them for a really long time.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the last point on this, we've moved all the way through this, and this has so much given me context and really brought this narrative that we read in the Gospels to life to me, man. You know, in a new way.
As I said to people as well, I definitely would recommend you check it out for yourselves. I'm not infallible, but I'm trying to do my best to add some color to this.
No, it's perfect, brother. It's perfect. I guess one of the final points that's interesting to me is that Jesus is then placed in a tomb, and according to the gospel narrative, Pilate grants the Jewish people a cohort of Roman guards to actually stand guard over that tomb. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, that was interesting to me, but even after this conversation, it begins to make more sense, because the Jewish people obviously didn't want his body to disappear. Mm-hmm. And then you got a bunch of people running around saying he was resurrected because he claimed he was going to be resurrected. Yeah. So the Jewish leaders have an interest in keeping the body in the tomb, but also the Romans have an interest in keeping the body in the tomb. Correct. In order to maintain peace. Correct. Within that region.
Correct, because once again, that could be... Let's look at when, as just kind of an example of Emperor Nero when he's killed. Well, for 20 years after he dies, there's Nero's popping up all over the Roman Empire saying, "I'm the new Nero," and trying to form an army behind them. So the Romans would have been looking at this situation in a very similar way. Obviously, Nero's after Christ, but it shows you what they would have been looking for. They wouldn't want, an army to pop up and say, this guy has risen and, they've stolen his body in order to do it. We see that in history as well, because you even see, when the Romanovs fall, there's different people claiming to be the missing Romanov. So historically, we do see what those things cause, and Romans would have been thinking about that, because ultimately for them, they don't really care about their doctrine, meaning the Jewish doctrine. They care about keeping peace in their empire and allowing grain to still flow from Egypt and Asia into Rome. And that's, the shipping lanes would flow through Jerusalem. So it's a very important place for them. So to have any sort of uprising there is a major problem. So that's what they're looking at. It's just preserving their peace.
So you're telling me Rome and the chief priests, the two powers that are existing within that region, both have an interest, a valuable interest, in keeping that body in that tomb.
Correct.
How on earth did that body come out of that tomb?
There's only one way, and that's that the resurrection is real and happened. There is only one way. There is no other way.
It's wild, man.
And then we see throughout, the Gospels of when Christ visits people after his resurrection and things like that. It's an important kind of proof, and I think one of the major things that allows Christianity to show it's not just another sect of Judaism, which is what Romans thought it was. They didn't realize that Christianity was something different, but it's also something that gives the proof, because it should have been impossible. It should have been impossible, and it was, because this place was guarded.
That's wild, dude. I mean, it's so encouraging to me personally.
Yeah.
I want to get into, I have a question about, now Christ is crucified, buried, resurrection happens, and the apostles begin, spreading this message of the resurrection of Christ and the forgiveness of sins through faith in Christ. And the apostles, to include the apostle Paul, most places they go, they are being persecuted, but it seems like most of the persecution against them is coming from the Jewish people in the places that they're going, and not so much the Roman Empire. But one thing, the Apostle Paul, there's an example in the Scriptures where he is being persecuted, and he basically calls out the fact that he is a Roman citizen.
That's an
and
important
I've
point.
always been confused about this. So the Apostle Paul is a Jewish man and really involved with the Jewish religious elite. I mean, he's super educated. He's some say he was a member of the Sanhedrin and all of this stuff, but he at the same time is a Roman citizen. How does that work, and what benefits would the Apostle Paul have for being a Roman citizen?
So I don't know, politically how he would have gotten citizenship. There's lots of different ways you could do it. You could be working for Rome where you could get it. You could fight in the legions for 25 years and get citizenship. Rome could annex your territory and take the political class and make them citizens. Citizenship gets watered down a lot in the early 3rd century. Emperor Caracalla in 212 gives citizenship to 30 million people overnight.
Wow.
And he does this because he's basically bankrupted the treasury, and he now has the ability to tax you, especially your inheritance. Inheritance tax is one of the biggest taxes. So he's trying to earn money that way. So citizenship really gets watered down after about 212. But if you look at through the Republic and through the early empire before 212, it was a very valuable thing to have. And there's one key reason why it's valuable. There's a story about Emperor Hadrian. He's the emperor in the early 120s. He's the guy that actually builds the wall in Britain. And he's walking through the streets, and a woman grabs his toga. And she has a problem she wants to talk to him about. And he says, basically, I don't have time to handle this problem for you. And she says, okay, well, stop being emperor. Because as emperor, or as a citizen, you had the ability to redress your grievances directly to the emperor. It was something that citizenship granted you. So St. Paul, in this case, would have had the ability, as a Roman citizen, to redress his grievances directly to the emperor. Now, as things change and citizenship loses value, that's not really going to matter as much in the mid-3rd century, but in the time period of Paul, that is really going to matter. So
and that's exactly what he does.
So because he's a citizen, he would have the ability to take his problem directly to the emperor. And as the empire changes, the emperor is going to be further and further removed from people. And you get to kind of a time period later on where a lot of people would have never seen an emperor, and they wouldn't even know what one was because they're so far removed from it. And they're more worried about, how did my crops do this year, or how much taxes do I owe? They would have cared very little or even knew who the next emperor was. But during his time period, he would have had the ability, because he was a Roman citizen, to address his grievances directly to the emperor.
And we see that in the Scriptures, and that's exactly what he does. And that's always been odd to me how he had the ability to do that, because these people are like, and I don't even know who.
Well, it's a core component of Roman citizenship. I don't know how he got his citizenship in particular, but it's a core component.
Yeah, I forget who or what the accusations were that were being brought against Paul in the moment that he says, I appeal to Caesar. And then all of a sudden, these people who are bringing these accusations against Paul are like, whoa.
Because he can do that. And
we didn't know you were a Roman citizen.
It's the biggest card he can pull out, because as a citizen, he can redress his grievances to the emperor. Now, the emperor might not have cared, but he could address his grievances directly to the emperor.
And that is what eventually gave Paul the opportunity to be in Rome and begin, or I guess, be the founder of the first Christian church in Rome.
Well, also a core component of that as well is, there's lots of letters of Paul in the New Testament and all the different places he goes. Citizenship is actually a key component to that, because it would have been modernly like have an American passport. You can go a lot of different places. Citizenship would have allowed him to travel more. So it was also a key component that allowed his ministry to happen too.
He was like the perfect candidate.
Correct.
For what?
But that goes back to God using the right people for the right purposes, even if they're imperfect, because he has, this major transformation on the road, and he's blind for a period of time, and he changes from Saul to Paul. So it might be an imperfect vessel, but he's the perfect person because of being a Roman citizen.
Yeah, because of being a Roman citizen, because of his vast knowledge of the Old Testament scriptures and the learning that he had in the Old Testament scriptures, and then being able to now explain to Jewish people the message of the gospel in context of the prophecies about Christ in the Old Testament. It was like he was just the perfect individual to go and do what he did.
Well, because just your regular follower of Christ, if they weren't a Roman citizen in this time period, they would not have been able to be as mobile as he was. So that citizenship is a key point to his mobility and a key point to how he spreads the gospel.
Paul was another dude that hustled.
He hustled a lot, man.
Paul hustled, man.
He wrote a lot. He saw a lot of places. He hustled.
Good night, man. This is so intriguing to me. Do you know of any lore or church history? Was the Apostle Paul, or what's the most accepted narrative about his death? Was the Apostle Paul killed by the Roman government? Or I know we don't know that definitively.
Yeah, I don't know as I know
narrative.
about St. Peter and how he's crucified upside down, but I don't know as much about what happens to Paul.
Because Paul winds up in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
In chains, he's imprisoned, and eventually they let him, it tells us they let him go out and walk around, and they give him some freedom of movement, but he's in Rome on trial, basically for being a troublemaker, I assume. And
it's a political problem now, because all the places he had been, all the groups he had united, that's a big political problem.
And we don't know how that panned out. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer for you. That like St. Peter, I could tell you, he's crucified upside down, and whatever it might be. But yeah, I don't have an answer on that.
But Rome probably wouldn't have liked the impact that he was making as he traveled around.
Because the thing they would be looking at is, okay, this guy's really mobile because he's a citizen. He's in all these different territories. Well, now he has the ability to create an uprising in 5, 10, 15 different places. So that starts to become a political problem for them. They could care less about what he's talking about, unless, of course, things aren't going so well and they're trying to restore the peace of the gods. But the fact that he's got roots down in many different areas, that would be a political problem for them.
Yep. And it is likely that his trial, or whatever you would call it, probably didn't go so well, because it would have been frowned upon what he was doing. So we could at least assume that would be a likelihood.
We could assume that something good did not happen to him because of that. And when you look at that, it comes back to, for the most part, Rome is permissive of other religions and other ideas, unless it starts to become a political problem for them.
And the Apostle Paul is causing some big waves.
Right, because he's in lots of different places.
He's in lots of different places, and he's so intelligent, he's so passionate, and a lot of people just can't even argue back against the points that he's making. And
Correct.
So, that's causing big waves.
And that's what you would have to look at, is they're looking at, okay, so he can disrupt all these different territories. Well, now this is something we need to handle. Yep.
It's wild, too, that it seems when you read the scriptural narrative of this, it seems that Paul appealed to Caesar simply for the sake of, he knew that was a direct route to get to Rome. Mm-hmm. And his goal, I think, ultimately was to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with Caesar. I think that was his goal. And it's like he intentionally made this appeal so he could gain an audience with Caesar in order to share the gospel. I mean, talk about a passionate person.
Well, at the same time,
That's
too,
wild.
I think also there's the standpoint of, I can get to do this a little bit longer, right? Because they could punish him and however they want to punish him, or he can claim his citizenship.
Yep.
So that there's an idea of, yes, an audience, I think, is a big part of it, but at the same time, he's extending his mission.
Yeah, that was his ace in the hole, essentially.
Yes.
He was waiting for the right moment.
It's a really, really key point about St. Paul. Like, citizenship, without it, he doesn't visit all the places he's been. He likely dies a lot sooner.
Yep.
And it gives him the authority to speak to a lot of people that wouldn't typically listen to someone who wasn't a Roman citizen.
Yeah. That's amazing, man. I want to move into talking about something that, again, I've never really understood, and that is the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, because it seems like that was a very tumultuous period, and like that was a big deal for them to this temple that the Jews had in Jerusalem was like a magnificent structure, from what I can gather about it. And like you said, I guess there were a lot of things in that temple that were very expensive. So why does Rome choose to destroy that temple?
Just goes back to politics and stability again, because once again, this is what Rome cared about. So Herod has a son. His son is a less stable client king than himself, and there starts to become a tax revolt in this area, meaning they won't pay their taxes to Rome. Well, now Rome's not going to be so happy with that. And this is kind of the thing that finally brings down the heavy hand. There is a general who's one of the key generals under Nero at this time, and his name is Vespasian. And Vespasian comes in and basically starts the conquest of Jerusalem. It's going to be finished by his son Titus once Vespasian becomes emperor after the death of Nero. There's kind of, I believe there's 2 short-lived emperors in between Nero and Vespasian, but then Vespasian is going to become the next emperor. And his son Titus basically finishes off these civil wars in Jerusalem, and it moves from having a client king to just being a Roman territory. So that really is the difference there. Once Rome isn't receiving their tax money and there's a political problem, and they've tried to handle this area a number of times over the previous 200 years, they come down very heavy-handedly. And that's really where the destruction of the temple comes in. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of that money is going to be what's used by Vespasian and his son Titus to later on build the, in their time period, they would have called it the Flavian Amphitheater, because Vespasian's family was the Flavian clan. But we call it modernly the Colosseum. So if you go to that modern Colosseum, a lot of that was built with wealth that was taken from the temple after the conquest happens.
Wow. I mean, I know this is like you're talking about wealth coming from that temple. Is this just like the items that were in the temple, like the golden, like
well,
gold?
It wouldn't have been
like,
just the temple, but it would have been some of that gold would have been melted down and used. And it would have been used to kind of trade. And then also any other wealth they could have just stolen from that territory. So it's not purely just the temple, but anything they would have taken during their conquest of Jerusalem. Because it goes from, we have a governor, we have a client king, things are going okay, but now it's like, okay, these people, they aren't paying their taxes. We're just going to kind of end this thing.
Yeah.
And it would have been, a lot of sacred relics would have been used and melted down, and a lot of those would have been used as wealth to then build this Colosseum and a lot of other works that Vespasian built in his lifetime.
And the consequences of that, were the Jewish people like dispersed at that point, or like were they still kind of centralized in Jerusalem, kind of doing the thing like they, because a lot of people were killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
yes.
It was a nasty conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what the consequences of that?
The consequences is this is where a major Jewish diaspora happens, and that's when a lot of them are going to leave that territory. Now, there's going to be some that are still willing to play ball with the Romans that are going to be there, but for the most part, this is where the kind of the Jewish diaspora happens, meaning they kind of spread throughout not just the Roman Empire, but even territories that weren't ruled by Rome. But it ceases to kind of be, a Jewish homeland after this time period. Because the Romans look at it as, well, it didn't work to do it that way. We're just going to establish it. And I believe Jerusalem after this time period, I don't know that it's under Vespasian. I think it's a little bit later under Hadrian, but the name of Jerusalem becomes Anatolia Capitolina. So it's they even changed the name of the city.
Wow. So huge change.
Yes.
Yeah. That's awesome, brother. I want to take a quick break, and then I want to come back and kind of dig into a little bit of more of your personal testimony and ask you some questions revolving around that.
Sure.
Roman Catholicism, and also got to check these coins out. So
Yeah, absolutely.
let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, Jeremy, we're back, and dude, we're hitting our goals here. I'm having fun.
I want to get into the Medici at some point too, because you mentioned Martin Luther, so I hope we can.
Yeah, we're about to kind of dig into some of that stuff. I can't help but ask some questions, personal questions to you about your faith and just kind of your testimony and your journey, since I have the opportunity to do so. First, I want to take a look at these coins you brought me, man, because I really appreciate a old coin.
So these are courtesy of my friend Dean Kinzer from Kinzer Coins. He's nice enough to provide these for me for the shows I'm on. So the first, let me just double check so I give you the right names here of what Dean gave me. He's always kind of making sure I know ahead of time of what I actually have, because he's always sending me cool stuff. So the first one I have here is Constantius II, who is the son of Constantine. Constantine being the first Christian emperor of Rome. And then this is Licinius II. And the reason he selected both of these for you is they're both warrior emperors. So he thought being somebody who's a warrior like yourself would enjoy having warrior emperor coins.
Dude, that's some amazing.
But Kinzer Coins always hooks me up. He's a great guy.
That's an amazing, I mean, thank you. That is an amazing piece of history. I'll treasure these for sure.
So they're about 2,000 years old.
Yeah, that is an amazing piece of history, man. Yeah, I've never even held anything like this. Super special, brother. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So getting into some, I guess some personal questions. I don't know if you generally get into this stuff on podcasts you do, but I am interested just to hear why you have kind of transitioned or moved away from your identity as a Roman Catholic to now you just described yourself more as non-denominational.
I'm just more spiritual, I'd say, in a lot of ways.
I'm interested in that because you obviously you've studied Roman Catholic theology, which is something that I'm an amateur study of too.
Sure.
I try. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
And I'm Protestant, so there's a lot of differences and a lot of things that we don't agree upon, and but what's that transition been for you? And
well, I guess for me, I've always been somebody that's been a seeker. I've always been looking for something. I don't know any other way to describe it. I was born Baptist. And then for a little bit, we were Presbyterian. Then I went to Catholic school in third grade. As an adult, I see the ADHD as my superpower, but in public school, it didn't work out so well for me. So I was a really high IQ kid in first grade, and I finished all my work really early. And they told my parents, well, we're going to put him in the talented and gifted program. My parents were like, oh, that's great. It just meant that my projects were longer. It didn't mean they were harder, more challenging, whatever. It was just to kind of keep me quiet. So I got wise to that. So I just stopped doing them. And eventually they had a conversation with my parents. They're like, so listen, if he doesn't go on medication, he can't stay here. And this was in public school. And my mom, being my mom, was like, well, yeah, we're definitely not going to do that. So they put me in Catholic school because I had a lot of friends that went there and whatnot. And I really academically excelled, did really well. And was kind of weird, but I made the decision myself that I was, going to become Catholic. So I went through the whole process to do that. My parents decided when they saw that, they would do that too. And that was, I went to Catholic undergrad. I went to Catholic college. So it really was a big part of my identity. But as I've gotten older, I've become much more spiritual in a lot of ways than really just saying, this is the exact way things are done, if that makes sense. In 2013, my mom had a really bad stroke. and she was in the hospital for 6 months. She spent a year in a long-term care facility, and to this day, she's still pretty badly disabled. That she lost all of her language skills. She has something called acute global aphasia, and she doesn't have mobility on the right side of her body, but she's with the help of some braces and things like that, she's been able to get around. And for me, like, I just had this terrible event in my life, and I just felt like I needed to go about it in a different way, if that makes sense. And so for me, it was becoming spiritual in a lot of ways. And, you know, I'm pretty honestly private about, you know, how I practice and things like that. But I would say, you know, I believe there's God. I don't believe that there's direct ways we have to access him, but I think, you know, we can access him through his words and, you know, through the ways we live our lives, so we can live our lives as good people. And honestly, that's how I look at it. You know, we still go to Easter Mass every year and things like that, but at the same time, that's how I've chosen to live my life since I had this, you know, kind of terrible event happen to me.
You obviously believe in the resurrection.
Yeah.
We talked about that. And, I want to dig into also just a little bit of the comments that you have made about, because you're so well versed in the church history and Catholic theology, and wanted to take the opportunity to get a little more or a little information from you around the Reformation and why that happened, because some of the comments I've heard you make about why Luther specifically was doing the things that he was doing aren't common knowledge to most people.
Well, so I think the thing to say first and foremost is that I'm not trying to say anything bad about the Catholic Church or anything like that. What I am saying is churches, no matter what denomination you're in, are made up of men. And men are fallible, right? It does happen. And if you look throughout history, the big thing I look at on my other channel, which is Hidden Forces of History, is the forces of power behind history, right? We have the history we're told, but maybe it's written in a certain way because a certain person was in power, or, you know, we don't hear about the people that were doing things. So often I'm looking at banking is actually it should be boring, but it's actually one of the biggest things that I'm often looking at. And there's a family in the 15th century called the Fugger. It's actually spelled Fugger. It's Fugger. And the Fugger were a banking family that managed to, through their wealth, buy the election of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So if you look at Charles V, a lot of the moves he made didn't make any sense because he had these investors behind him he had to please. So banking throughout history has been a real problem. So now if you look at the Reformation, one of the major causes of this is the sale of indulgences. Have you heard the term indulgence before?
Yes, yeah.
So basically, for people that don't know, it was you were paying for a ticket out of purgatory for somebody that may be in purgatory after their death. And the current St. Peter's Basilica, well, I guess to back it up, the first church of Rome is the Church of St. John Lateran, which is built in the 5th century. As we go further down the road, Pope Julius II, who's two popes after Alexander VI. Alexander VI is the guy that divides America between the Portuguese and the Spanish. And he had this son, Cesare Borgia, that was a cardinal, decided he didn't want to be a cardinal anymore, and he becomes what's called a condottiere, which is basically a military commander for hire. And he conquers most of Italy, but then he gets sick and isn't really ready for his own death, and then his father, the Pope, dies, because Alexander VI was his father. So then Julius II comes in, not really a fan of Cesare, so Cesare ends up actually dying due to some of the actions of Julius II. Julius II starts building St. Peter's Basilica, and it becomes kind of it's never officially the Church of the Papacy. It's always going to be the Church of St. John Lateran, but it becomes the biggest church in Rome. Now, if you go down the road a little bit more, you've heard of the Medici, right? The banking family. So the Medici are a family from Florence, and they had managed on several occasions to get themselves kicked out of Florence. They're back in Florence, but basically they were in banking. and they managed to become the bankers of the Pope around the time of Julius II. And eventually, I think it's Giuliano de' Medici, becomes Pope Leo X. So now you have a Medici Pope.
Okay.
And what he's going to end up doing is he wants to take St. Peter's and make it the grand scale that you see it as now, because a lot of the architecture you see on it now are built on the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. He's got a problem. He needs more money in order to do that. So that's where the sale of indulgences comes from, is the Medici banking family decides that if we're going to fund this project, we need an influx of money, and that's where the indulgence crisis comes from. And that's one of the major things that's going to upset Martin Luther and lead to his 96 Theses. Now, obviously, there's other things he was upset about, but it's the indulgences, which is the main point that pushes this.
Yep. And
I know there was a lot of color to that, so I apologize. I bounced around.
Another more personal question, just because of your background, your education, and your involvement for many years with the Roman Catholic Church and theology. I'm always interested because I have not yet found a Roman Catholic who will come sit down and deliberate with me.
Sure.
Like a practicing Roman Catholic, because I want to do that. I say many inflammatory things about Roman Catholic theology.
Sure.
From your experience, what is the Roman Catholic perspective on Protestants, even to this day? Because we know back during Luther's time, it wasn't good.
Yeah.
Is it still that way today?
I think the tenor of our world has changed a lot, honestly. And I think we've gotten to a place where, and I think the pandemic was a big part of this as well, like it's kind of pushed people of good faith to realize, we might be looking at the same thing in different ways. And I think that's a lot of the place we've gotten to. And I think we see a lot more collaboration of people that may not have the same belief systems, but in the end, we want the same thing. Yeah. So I think people have started to recognize evil. And I think we've seen that with, the pandemic and things like the Epstein files, which has been absolutely outrageous that someone would let that happen. So I think in a lot of ways, we've seen a religious revival in a lot of ways. And I think because of that, people of faith can collaborate, and it's gotten a lot easier. And I think you're seeing that in a lot of ways. You're seeing, Jews and Christians get along better. You're seeing, other religions get along better. So I think, honestly, it's I don't know. That's the climate I've experienced.
It hasn't. Yeah, it has improved. Yeah,
it's improved because if you look at it, this gets back to the politics of things. Like in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, religion and politics were the same thing, right? And we've the biggest thing we have in America, and it permits so many different religions to exist, is the separation of church and state. It allows people to have their own belief system, but make sure we're doing the right thing morally. Now, there is a caveat to that, which people don't talk about. The separation of church and state wasn't actually anything written in anything anywhere. It was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend of how he thought we should handle things. So we often talk about the separation of church and state, but it was just a personal letter that Jefferson wrote to somebody. But the point I think that's important to understand is we are a Christian nation. We are built on that. We're built on moral and upright way of being. And I think a lot more people of goodwill and a lot of people of different religions are realizing the things around us right now. It matters less to squabble about what we believe and more about, preserving our civilization, right? Preserving our culture. I think that's really what it comes down to, and making it a less abrasive thing.
I've been thinking a lot about that very thing you're talking about, because I personally can be very polarizing in my comments.
Sure.
And I'm a very passionate person. But I'm getting to a point now where I look around me at what's going on in our country, and it's making me a little nervous.
Well, because I think the number one thing we can do is to respect the religious belief of others. I think that's really, really important. But it's like at the same time, we need to call evil what it is. And it's becoming very visible right now.
Yeah. I've been considering this quite often, like the need that we have right now as a nation for unity
Yes.
even in spite of our differences in belief. Because I think that if we don't achieve unity as citizens of this country,
Correct.
at some point, it is getting to the point that it's making me a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
Like it's not really a game anymore, or just something that we can laugh about, or
Correct.
Joke around the dinner table. And
because we've lost ethics, and if you look at ethics controls everything, right? If and it's the job of the people in the group to keep the ethics of the group in, right? So it's like if we're allowing those things to slide, if somebody's Catholic or somebody's Protestant or Jewish or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like we all have a responsibility to our group to make those things work.
Yep.
And I think that's the bigger picture.
I think it is too. I have kind of an odd question that came up off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Because of a conversation I heard you have on the Citizen podcast.
Yeah.
Just about
Dan's a good dude.
Yeah. I mean, a great interview. Great. You guys both did awesome. He's a very well thought through guy. But you guys were kind of having a conversation about, in terms of the morals and ethics that our nation is built off of. What was more influential, or can you even discern what was more influential in terms of what our nation is built off of morally, ethically? Did Rome have a bigger influence, or did Judeo-Christian morals and ethics have a bigger influence on the founding of our country? Because I guess you could say, I don't think it would be debatable that both had an influence.
Well, I think they both have an influence, and I think it's from the perspective of, for the most part, but without Jefferson, because Jefferson was more of a deist, but like our founding fathers were Christian men, right? And our society is built off of that. But at the same time, they were way more well-read than most people are now. So they've read Plato, they've read, Cicero, they've read a lot of philosophers. So they would have looked at how did these things work politically? Because you do have to look at a political system; it has to exist. But how do we make one that's just and one that's going to work for others? So I think it's influenced heavily by both, honestly. But I think as well, if you look at how the founding fathers even wrote the Constitution, they were looking at it from how would somebody from a Christian moral perspective do certain things. And I think when we start to lose that identity, we start to lose a little bit of what was the Constitution, right? So I think at the same time, it comes from the viewpoint that they're writing in, right? And I think we've, as a country, we've changed a lot. But now, as I said, I think the pandemic was a big part in this. People saw evil, they saw it for what it was, and I think we've seen a religious revival in a lot of ways. Even like the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Like after that happened, a lot more people started going to church. So I think in a lot of ways, we've kind of been pushed to the brink. And I think when people have been pushed to the brink, they want to get back to what's moral, upright, and just. So I think in some ways, we have the ability to get back to, how was our Constitution written? Why was it written as it was? And what was expected to us? Yeah. So I know it's a kind of a roundabout way of saying it, but I think it's equally influenced by both, because you have the kind of spiritual world they're living in when they're writing, but then you also have kind of the philosophical world they're living in when they're writing.
Yeah, I guess going back to the first portion of our conversation, the statement that Pilate made, "What is truth?" I've been considering a lot of the dilemma around how when we as a nation, when we choose to throw out the moral aspect or the moral guidelines that have been given to us by the Creator, when we choose to stop identifying, you can just say the 10 Commandments. Yeah. Like our moral and ethical code is kind of framed by the 10 Commandments, for instance, here in America. Right. But when we choose to say, no, you know what, that doesn't have authority, really. Like it's not from God, and we choose to cast God out of kind of the equation. we should all come to the same conclusion that Pilate came to. Like, what is truth? Like, if we don't accept that there is a definitive truth about how we are to conduct ourselves as human beings in this life, then at that point, truth becomes relative to whatever you choose to believe when you wake up this morning. Whatever's good, whatever's you decide's good, whatever you decide's bad. And it causes chaos, man. And I wonder if people aren't like getting to the end of that, because we've been through a period of time here in the country where, through the 90s and the growing up in the 2000s, like we were moving further and further and further away from God and scriptural truth and faith and all this, and kind of casting that off as just a bunch of archaic bull crap. And it seems like people are finally starting to realize, oh, wow, that's actually important stuff. We might need to go back and take another look at that.
But I think there's also another core point to that as well. And that doesn't really have anything to do with religion, and that's responsibility. If you do something, you're responsible. If you don't do something, you're also responsible, right? Like, responsibility goes a lot of different ways. And we've been told that we have no responsibility now for the condition we're in, right? We're made to feel like we have no agency. And I think that is a really important point as well, because we do have responsibility whether we do or don't do something, right? So I think that's also a huge component that's been lost in a lot of ways, that, you might be in bad condition, but no matter what, you're responsible for your own condition, right? And that might mean you can fix that condition or not fix that condition, but you can actively do something about it. And I think that's the bigger thing to look at. In a lot of ways, we live in a victim culture. And I think that is a major, major problem as well.
I would agree 100%, brother. I have a personal question for you.
Yeah.
You being a man who is very passionate about history, and you just, it comes through in the way that you speak. And when you do read the scriptures, do you read the scriptures as a historical document?
I don't think you can do it that way, right? Like, I think it's you're kind of separating the spirituality from what actually happened. That's the way of looking at even Josephus, as I said. We're looking at a historical context that something happened. I think when you're reading, the gospel in a lot of ways, there's divine inspiration to that, right? And it's brought through human vessels in a lot of ways. So I think you can't read it as a complete historical document. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, I think to say that there is a lot more divine inspiration in it than just that.
Yep. What is your favorite book in the scriptures to study, to read?
I think Acts of the Apostles.
Is it really, man?
Because you can see how regular people kind of have a big influence, because a lot of us as regular people, have the ability to make a huge impact. And you don't have to be anybody special or do anything important, but it's the things that you do have a big impact. Like, you treat your neighbor better, well, your neighbor might treat somebody else better, right? So I think, and that gets back to responsibility. Like, we can all do something in our little sphere.
That's good, man. We're going through the book of Acts right now.
Oh, really?
Every Monday we do a show called Monday Meeting, and we're going through the book of Acts, just kind of verse by verse, chapter by chapter. And you're right, man. There is so much there.
Well, it shows us what one person can do, right? And I think that's the most important thing to understand. It's because if you even look at our current political condition, I've had conversations with so many different people kind of about our current political position, but there's two that stand out for me. When I was talking to Colonel Douglas McGregor, and when I spoke to General Mike Flynn, and I asked them, what can a regular person do about the current world we live in? And their thing was, take care of your neighbor, get involved in your school board, get involved in your local community, because most people are so concerned about national politics. And honestly, it doesn't really matter a hill of beans. What happens in your local area is what matters. And if we take responsibility in our own spheres, in our own lives, in our own families, that has a really big impact, even if it's just as you as an example, right? If somebody sees how you act and they say, okay, well, I'm going to do that too, because that's a good example.
We've said before on the show, the family is the smallest form of government, essentially. Like the way your
family can be a dictatorship at times too, not always.
Yeah, so it can be ran well or not, but everything bleeds out from that point. Like that individual responsibility of the husband and the wife. How is this family unit being conducted, and how are they operating?
The impact you create with your children, right? If you're raising your children well to be good, moral, and upstanding people, well, the effect they're going to create. It's the idea of a ripple, right?
Yep.
You throw a rock into the water, and that rock is a small rock, but you see all the ripples come out from it. And that's how you have to consider with every action you take in your life is all the effects it creates, even if they're unintended.
That's good stuff, man. Good word, brother. Good encouragement for everybody listening to the show.
Well, because I think we're told that we have no agency, and we have a ton of agency. It just, for some, might be on a smaller level than others, but you have it. You do.
Yeah, it's almost like the system that exists almost beats it out of you.
Yeah.
It beats that mindset out of you to where you no longer believe that there's even anything that you can do to change the course of things, even on a very small scale. Like, it's not even worth it anymore. And people are, another thing too, man, people are having to hustle so hard just to, like, be able to afford the necessities of life. I think that's another way the system's designed to almost to beat that mindset out of you. Like, I don't have capacity to even do anything to make an impact because I'm so focused on just.
But you can still make an impact, right? And that, like, if you're
even in the midst of that,
if you're a parent raising your kids right, if you're
digging a ditch somewhere, what about the guys around
ditch,
you?
You know
dig
what I mean?
A better ditch. Like, I agree.
Like, I'm one of those weird people. My wife tells me this is going to get me, like, shot at some point. But, like, I tend to stop when I see people on the side of the road and ask how I can help them. And people are really weirded out by that now, by the way, because they're kind of like, wait, you want to help me? But, like, it's those little things. Help a fellow traveler. Like, that's an important thing to do. And so I think it's taking all of those things into account in your life. Like, how can you do the best you can at everything you do? Like, how can you be excellent everywhere?
That's good stuff, brother. I have asked all of my questions. Have we missed anything important?
No, I think we've covered kind of like the key components, but I think one important thing, so my other main channel is called The Roman Pattern. And we talk about the how civilizations collapse. And the point that you just made about, I have the cost of everything is going up and things like that. I think that's a key component that people also need to take a look at, because your money is being destroyed, and that's how civilizations fall. So I think at the same time, we need to solve some of these problems, because those problems become so big, then some people feel like they can't do anything. So I think we have to look at how do we solve our current economic condition, and that comes from getting back to a strong currency. It comes back to bringing industry back here, right? Like because that gives people jobs and an ability to contribute, and when you contribute, you feel good about yourself. So I think at the same time, we do need to hold elected officials accountable, no matter what party they're in, for what they're like. This week, the Fed said they're injecting $16 trillion in the economy. Well, that means that every dollar in your pocket is now worth less. That's what inflation is. It doesn't mean that things get more expensive. It means your dollar is worth less. So the thing I would say to people is, I don't care what your political affiliation is, you can't let your government destroy your money, because that is where civilizations go into a downslide.
Yeah. You mentioned 2020, and the first time that it became really shocking to me personally was when the government was doling out all this money to people. And I was like, we're going to have to suffer the significant consequence of this. But people were just lapping it up, man.
Yeah.
Like, people were just like, what can I get? Like, what can I get for free? How much money can I get for? And I get it. There were probably some circumstances where that was needed to help people.
No, that's 100%
in some
true.
situations.
Like businesses that couldn't work.
But
and things
man,
like that.
but I remember seeing that. And I think everybody got checks in the mail during this pandemic, and I think I even got one, and
I'm like direct deposit. I don't know how they got my banking information.
I'm like, what is this even for? Like, I don't need this.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking the whole time, this is gonna hurt at some point.
It's gonna hurt, and I think that's one of the core problems that we're dealing with right now that most people aren't aware of. Because inflation is a very dangerous thing, because it's intoxicating when you're living through it, right? Of all the things you can do and whatever it might be. But it goes back to responsibility. If you take that check, if you vote for that thing that's going to, give X number of dollars to something, what is that doing to all the dollars that currently exist? Because the government has a credit card that doesn't have a limit on it. They just raised the limit. So I think it's something to understand, what are we doing for short-term gains and what are we causing in the future? Because that's also a point of responsibility.
So on this topic, you have your podcast as a resource.
Yeah.
What are some other books that have really resonated with you that you would recommend people to read to kind of draw these parallels and educate themselves about what might be happening around them?
Well, I would always tell people to go to primary sources. I think that's really important. You can get somebody else's opinion of it. I hope they're at least excited to go learn something from what I'm talking about today, but I'm not a primary source. I'm not 2,000 years old. The thing I would say is primary sources. So like Cicero is a really good person to read. Suetonius is a really good person to read. It's not quite a primary source, but his viewpoints are still interesting. Edward Gibbon, that wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, is it's a good secondary source. So there's a lot of good primary sources out there. I would say go find some that you can read. And the thing I would say as well is a lot of that language is written differently. So I would say as well, don't go past words you don't understand. Make sure you keep a dictionary next to you so that you fully grasp it. Because Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is beautifully written, but it's very hard to read. So I would say, even if you get a like an abridged copy or something, just so you get kind of the main points of it. But
is it written in the Old English?
It's written in the Old English. It's written in the Old English, so it is. But it's very beautiful language.
I love that too. Yeah.
But I would say keep a dictionary next to you. Don't go past things you don't understand, because you're not going to grasp it and you're going to say this sucks and I don't want to read it anymore.
That's a good word.
So I think it's really important to just have a full concept of what you're reading. That's
a good word, man. What's next for you, Jeremy? What are you most passionate about right now? Where are you headed?
Well, the agency, we're just really trying to become kind of the only one in our space that really helps set up these great conversations is a real big point to that.
And talk about exactly what you provide there.
Yeah. So we help our clients to appear not just in the right podcasts, but to communicate in the right way. Because as we were talking about in the beginning,
dialing that message.
In that message. Like if you use me as an example, right? I had my master's in history. I didn't do anything with it for 20 years. And then a couple of years ago, it popped up in popular culture. So I just started having conversations about it. I didn't really have my own developed thesis then, but we've gotten closer and closer to what the framework is that I've observed, and I call that the Roman pattern. So our real goal is to help people hone in what they're talking about in a way it's going to make a really great impact, and then also help them to appear on the right podcasts. And I think it's important to understand, because as an agency, I've had a podcast myself since 2014. So I'm looking at, how do we make this a great fit for the host and the guest? Because we want them, this is a space I want to see grow and continue, and I don't want people that are in here just to kind of pillage and get whatever they want to get. I want people that are going to add to the conversation, that are going to make this world a better place. And one of our big purposes as a company is to better the world and help mankind. And we do that through big conversations. So that's what we do, is we help people to talk on the right podcasts and really help them get pro-survival messages across.
Man. One, that's a valuable resource that resonates.
Well, and you
with
turn
me.
a lot of messages away because they're not pro-survival, right?
Yep. And two, not only is it a valuable resource, but it is a awesome mission, man.
Thank you.
It's an impactful mission.
Thank you. Well, because
as
a person,
man.
I can only do so much. But if I can help other people that really want to help people, then that's a really big deal.
That's solid, brother. That's solid to know that is the driving mission behind the resource that you're providing to people. Yeah. Where can our listeners find you, follow you? What are the best places to go to connect with you or get more information about working with Command Your Brand?
So commandyourbrand.com is our website. And if they go over there, we have something called the brand authority analysis. It'll kind of show them where they stand, where their blind spots are, and how we can help. If they want anything from me, I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate on all platforms. And my 2 channels are Hidden Forces in History and The Roman Pattern.
Amazing, brother. Jeremy, this was such a blessing.
Thank you.
No, thank you, brother. I really can't wait to release this one. I had a blast.
Same here.
All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Go check Jeremy out. And if you got something out of this show, made you think, if you learned something new, share it with somebody. It means a lot to us here at 3 of 7 Project. We love all of you guys. Enough said.
That was awesome.